Hello everyone, I'm John Burke, and I'm inside Radio City Music Hall in New York City. Coming up next on Hollywood Reel to Reel is the fascinating one-hour special, The Man Who Drew Bug-Eyed Monsters, celebrating the work of Reynold Brown, who created over 250 movie posters in the 1950s and 60s. While most of his work deals with monster movies such as The Creature from the Black Lagoon and Tarantula, he also created posters for such big-budget films as Ben-Hur and How the West Was Won. The 1957 sci-fi adventure Invasion of the Saucermen follows. And if you'd like to learn more about our Reel to Reel series, be sure to check out our website, amctv.com. Here is The Man Who Drew Bug-Eyed Monsters.
Young people who went to movies in the 1950s, I think, placed a great deal of stock in the poster. I know I used to go to two theaters in upstate New York called the Madison and the Arnett religiously every weekend, and we always spent a long time before the movie started, and you always got there very early just to perform this action, studying posters in the lobbies and trying to figure out what was going to happen next week. You had a little bit of a serial. You even had newsreels sometimes in the 1950s, and certainly cartoons. So you were even more dependent, it would seem to me, on the poster, and very much interested in them and engaged by them. I can't say that we ever stood around and said, wow, look at the rupture of the picture plane as 6-year-olds, but we did say, oh, we gotta come and see that one.
I was a kid growing up in a very small mill city, a pretty dismal place, and movies were a great escape, and movie posters were the sort of the open sesame to that portal of escape. And I found that I gravitated to posters that I didn't know were Reynolds, but actually were Reynold Brown, because he had this hyper sense of reality and hyper sense of color, the kinds of bombardment of images that kids really respond to. And the audience for these movies was mostly kids, so he knew the audience that he was addressing, and he certainly had a customer in me.
I would look at this and say, God, how's he do it? How does he do it? See, and that's what made Reynold unique. And that's the reason studios used him, because he captured something that they didn't even have in photographs or even in print. See, he captured his own imagination and put it down on paper and in a painting.
He was an illustrator who seldom signed his work, yet his images are recognized the world over. He devoted much of his life to flattering Hollywood's most glamorous stars, but most of them had never heard of him. To his neighbors, he was a model of humdrum plainness, the father of 8 children, but his inner life was torn by contradictions. In his paintings, he depicted Middle America's most romantic longings, paranoid fears, and bizarre fantasies. Reynold Brown was one of the great Hollywood movie poster artists of his time, who left Hollywood in disgust, driven away by an onslaught of movies about monsters, motorcycles, and beach parties. He moved as far away from his former life as anyone could, to the near total isolation of western Nebraska. In the middle of nowhere, he lived out his life pursuing art for its own sake, burning bridges to the past. This was a man who drew bug-eyed monsters. He has a following in the world he will not see again. He was born William Reynold Brown in Los Angeles in 1917, the year Woodrow Wilson vowed to make the world safe for democracy. His father was a German immigrant's son, a short, stocky railroad engineer who thought what he did was nobody's business. Not his habit of wearing a 3-piece suit to the grocery, or the fact that he changed his socks 3 times a day. His mother, the daughter of a Scotch-Irish linen merchant from Belfast, was a perfectionist. The Browns held themselves a notch above the provincial middle class of California's San Gabriel Valley, and together they cultivated meekness, subordination, and civility in their children. Reynold and his sisters grew up indoors, not out, mastering the violin, listening to opera on the radio, speaking a proper English, and drawing. By the age of 5, pastimes other than drawing interested Reynold not at all. He drew constantly. In later years, he would speak of sitting quietly on his back porch, filling tablets with scenes of mortal combat from the First World War. In 1937, at age 20, Brown went to art school. He entered Otis Art Institute in Los Angeles. The summer following his first year, Brown was called home. His father was dying of lung cancer. With a mother and 2 sisters to support, Brown's formal education ended. Brown had landed his first steady job as an illustrator a year earlier, drawing panels for Hal Forrest's comic strip, Tailspin Tommy. Forrest, a facile draftsman with a flair for the cliffhanger, was gruff and demanding. In the beginning, Reynold was the pick and shovel man of the operation, slavishly inking each predetermined frame for reprint in hundreds of newspapers across the country. Soon he would influence storyline and draw much of the strip's original art. After 4 years, he was fed up with it, and with Forrest. Finally, Reynold gave notice and left a panicky, screaming former employer behind. The year Brown left Forrest was no less than momentous. It was 1941. Events in Europe had built to a terrible storm. Brown was 22 years old. For the next 5 years, he worked for North American Aviation. Brown spent the war making cutaway drawings of the interior components of fighter planes. He also drew scenes of air combat missions for Air Force tabloids, portraits of generals, whatever the war effort hurled at him. He loved it. He also loved one of his fellow illustrators, a beautiful Swiss-Mexican girl from a well-to-do California family by the name of Mary Louise. In 1946, he married his former colleague at North American. Her family, devout Catholics, were, for the moment, horrified. His family, nominal Methodists, were not. The war over, his career at a crossroads, he decided to go east. Post-war America was an exaggerated capitalistic free-for-all. New York was a hotbed of consumerism, restyling itself hand over fist. The art world would soon be in turmoil. By the time Brown arrived on the scene, the public esteem for illustrators had faded. Tarred by the brush of commercialism, the illustrator had no friend in the art critic either. Nevertheless, there was money to be made. Burgeoning advertising and publishing markets were hungry for what Brown had to offer. For the next 5 years, he illustrated magazine stories for Argosy, Boy's Life, Outdoor Life, Popular Science, and Mechanics Illustrated. He also illustrated covers for Signet and Bantam paperback books, among them Walter Van Tilburg Clark's The Oxbow Incident and William Faulkner's Sanctuary. Though he worked comfortably from imagination and from life, Brown stored up sheaves of reference material and intermediate drawings for his commissions. He also used snapshots of himself for reference, and occasionally talked his family into posing for drawings. Always it was a matter of achieving the illusion of reality. Brown, the hunter, the militiaman, the barroom drunk, a fighter, a singer, a man on the run. In 1951, Brown and his family returned to Los Angeles. Brown was 34 years old, fair-haired, and ramrod straight. His looks could have gotten him a screen test. He couldn't have been less interested. Los Angeles was a glitzy town of 2 million in 1951. Joseph Mankiewicz had just won an Academy Award for All About Eve. John Huston had just premiered The Asphalt Jungle, starring the young, relatively unknown Marilyn Monroe. And Louis B. Mayer, still the head of MGM in 1951, was the most powerful man in Hollywood. It was a roaring, paranoid town of egos. On top of it all, dozens of film stars, writers, producers, and directors sat before the House Un-American Activities Committee in one of the most insidious manhunts of the decade. The shy, retiring illustrator paid no attention to any of it. In 1951, Brown got a job teaching head and figure drawing at Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. His students remember him as a kindly, orthodox teacher and modest to a fault. At a faculty exhibition, Brown's work caught the eye of Misha Kalis, one of Universal Studios' most prolific art directors, with a string of successful movie poster campaigns to his credit. Kalis offered Brown the chance to paint the poster art for The World in His Arms, starring Gregory Peck and Ann Blythe. Reynold pounced on the opportunity. Brown was paid $350 for his first big commission. He supplied a dozen preliminary drawings and a completed painting. Like every other promotion department illustrator, he worked tirelessly, and nobody noticed. Never in studio art departments was there a promise of more work to come. In Hollywood, Brown remembered, once you've finished a job, you're out of work.
Motion picture art was produced solely for the purpose of selling tickets. And the producers of the movies had no interest at all in whether the artwork was artistic. If it sold tickets, they loved it.
I'm not aware that the function of any poster for any picture has ever been anything than to sell tickets for the picture. We probably were a little more overt in what we were doing than the major studios, but what we were trying to do was to entice the audience, to show to the audience that this was a film they wanted to see.
Reynold knew how to direct the eye. He knew how to capture the mood and show what was most important about that movie and that image. So his images grab the eye and don't let go. You see it on the pulp novel covers that he did. You certainly see it in the movie advertising that he did. He had a natural instinct and a natural showmanship for selling what Hollywood had to offer.
In the 50s, as before, big studios lavished fortunes on poster campaigns, from the modest 1-sheets to the gargantuan 48 sheets, eclipsing whole sides of multi-story buildings. Like movie stars, movie poster illustrators were typecast in certain styles. Brown was often given historical epics to illustrate: Spartacus, Mutiny on the Bounty, and Ben-Hur. As well as getting the likenesses of the stars, Brown could be depended on to dream up an accompanying vignette of action for the background design.
Brown was especially capable in this regard because he could make up as much as he relied on reference. He had so much experience that he could almost make up anything he needed and draw it from any position he wanted.
He had all these wonderful little touches, and he wasn't tight in, like people airbrush. She would never use an airbrush or pick at little hairs on the head or something. No way. Everything was a broad stroke. It told exactly what the person was, what he was doing.
Preceding the painted key art were thumbnail sketches and comprehensive pencil studies. For movies with big-name stars like James Stewart and Rock Hudson, an art director would sketch in ovals where the faces of the actors were to be drawn. Always, the size of an actor's head reflected the size of his contract with the studio. For Backlash, Richard Widmark's head was larger than Donna Reed's. In Last of the Fast Guns, Jock Mahoney was larger than Gilbert Roland. Men's heads were almost always larger than women's. The final art was most often painted in opaque watercolor and only rarely in oil. That version might undergo endless revisions by studio brass, or even be cut apart and the figures transplanted to new backgrounds by the art director. After all this, the original art and a mechanical, showing the final position of credits and titles, was shipped to a lithographic house to be reproduced in the cheapest possible way. The work itself remained anonymous and unsigned.
The movie companies did not want to sell the poster artist. They wanted to sell the star, they wanted to sell the vehicle, they wanted to sell widescreen, whatever it was they wanted to sell. None of those included the poster artist.
It was very difficult for an artist to put his personal stamp on pictures like these because they had so many requirements that had to be met, and they could only be done in a realistic way. And once they became less realistic and looked more artistic, they became less effective. The producers of the films didn't want an artist's individuality to compete with the personality or the visage of the stars. And they certainly didn't want the artist to sign his work.
The illustrator is the victim of just about everybody. He's got an art director telling him that his lettering has to be this high and it has to be organized in this direction. And he has an audience that whose expectations can't be calibrated at all because it's a mass audience. It's absolutely enormous. This work is not going to be hidden away in some kind of museum. It's going to be out there in front of naive little 6-year-olds in upstate New York, and it's going to be out there in front of salivating, sex-crazed teenagers on their way to the drive-in, and it's going to be seen by adults, and it's going to be seen by people who walk past newsstands. And the ability to create something that can, in fact, perform in this world, i.e. sell a product, make people interested in what they're looking at, boy, that's no mean task.
Competition among studios and theater owners was to the death. The average number of movies released each week never slumped below 15. Because of the short runs, movie theaters depended on audiences getting familiar with their product fast. Added to this was television. The sale of TV sets doubled between 1949 and 1950. While Americans were glued to the tube, movie attendance plummeted, and scores of downtown theaters throughout the country closed and converted to restaurants, furniture stores, and bowling alleys. The effort to get the fickle movie-going public to cast off their TV trays and leave Hopalong Cassidy to fend for himself redoubled. The drive-in was born. By 1951, more than 3,000 drive-ins countrywide wooed families with in-car heaters, diaper service, and even free Bibles. Outnumbering families were teenagers who flocked to drive-ins to see movies like Love Slaves of the Amazon and I Was a Teenage Werewolf. A snappy title and an ad campaign brought them in by the carload.
My partner, Jim Nicholson, was a great title man. He was a man who would have a few drinks at night, and not too much, but he'd come in the next morning and he'd say, "Sam, I think I've got a great title." And I would listen with breath abated, and he would say, "I Was a Teenage Werewolf." And I knew instinctively that that was $1 million title going to go on a $100,000 picture. There had never been a picture with the word teenage in the title, but it fitted exactly what we were aiming at.
The 50s would also produce a variety of technical innovations. Audiences could now see Buona Devil, The House of Wax, and The Charge at Feather River in 3D. There was more to come. Theater owners bitten hard by competition from TV, pounced on sci-fi and horror films.
Always you wanted to grab the eye. You wanted to tell exactly what the ticket would buy. And what the ticket would buy in the case of horror movies was usually sex, violence, and Holocaust.
Incredibly huge, with incredible desires for love.
And of course, you wanted to show the monster as representative of that Holocaust. So even if what you had in the movie looked like spaghetti on strings, what you showed in the poster was an enormously frightening creature from the id, covered with hair, loaded with tentacles, and something far more interesting than the movie ever delivered. A giant monster 100 feet high, or beauty by day, lusting queen by night. And they spoke to that same sense of larger than life, something really dangerous and strange that you're going to see here, and they really drew people in.
But we came back. We came back week after week, and it was largely the posters that drew us in. Despite the clear evidence of our own eyes and experience that these films were virtually all alike, somehow or another you'd get outside after this black and white experience, and the color poster and these marvelous actions, and the fact that the monsters are always huge, of course, and they never actually turn out to be quite so big. I can remember Godzilla posters, for example, that advertised this monster is actually big, so that you would go.
Generally speaking, the posters had something to do with the movies, but, and there were some cases, as a matter of fact, where the posters brought out something new, where we actually went back and would shoot an extra scene. But there were, of course, times, and that's true of every company, when they exaggerate. Let's just say they exaggerate. Not mislead, really, but just exaggerate.
A film should be exciting, just that. You can do almost anything to an audience except bore them. And the advertising campaign should be even more exciting than the film.
There were some exhibitors, more than one, as a matter of fact, who would say to me, Sam, you ought to put sprocket holes in the posters and throw the pictures away. Which he meant well. I think he meant well.
Publicity stunts associated with the horror genre flourished throughout the decade. William Castle, B-movie horror king, dominated the period with numberless promotions, all of them outrageous. Among them, the Fright Break, which offered refunds for cowards who could not face the last terrifying moments of homicidal. The Lloyds of London life insurance policy that protected your family if you were frightened to death at the movies. And Castle's magnum opus, Percepto, in which buzzers on the theater seats delivered a jolt of electricity when the Tingler appeared on screen. This was an age in which more than 600 UFO sightings each year of the decade came to life in a great invasion of B-movies.
Only one scientist dared investigate the incredible phenomenon. How a pet dog reverted to an antediluvian wolf.
Look at those teeth. That dog is a throwback.
Now, before your very eyes, see a man revert to a half-human anthropoid from the dawn of creation. A monster leaving behind a trail of death and destruction.
Oh, it's impossible. Nobody's got a footprint like that.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? Or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism.
That's not the question.
It was also an age in which the national uproar over communism would spawn a rash of anti-communist movies, including The Iron Curtain, The Red Menace, and I Married a Communist. And because it was clear that to be a communist was also to be an atheist, there was an outbreak of religious epics. David and Bathsheba, The Egyptian, Land of the Pharaohs, The Ten Commandments, and King of Kings, which all made millions at the box office. The era was also dominated by riots over integration at Little Rock, the dreaded fear of polio, and the national obsession with nuclear war.
With the knowledge of the first atomic explosions to guide us, our chances for survival will be far better than those of the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, if we act on our knowledge and are prepared. Select the basement wall nearest the probable target area of your city. If the house is blown over, it will most likely fall away from this wall.
In Betty's school, they are talking about the atomic bomb, too. Betty is asking her teacher, how can we tell when the atomic bomb may explode? And her teacher is explaining that there are two kinds of attack, with warning and without any warning.
America's sublimated fears and paranoias were no less than inspirations to the feature film treadmill. To studio illustrators like Reynold Brown, the country's obsessions were often filtered through a movie title: Attack of the Puppet People, Atomic Submarine, or The Incredible Shrinking Man.
Another factor that makes the movie poster so fascinating is that it creates a sort of mythological world. And in that mythological world, American innocents, full of potential fecundity, are menaced from alien quarters. I mean, you can imagine this is Russians. You can imagine it's Red Chinese. You can imagine it's the kind of monsters from outer space that haunted the national imagination in the 1950s.
We wanted to see those images of destruction come home to roost, perhaps to warn us that nuclear experimentation would backfire, that science would finally outstrip us and take us over. And science and monsters in the form of literal monsters or disguised as communists would finally dominate and rule us all.
It seems to me that it was in the 1950s, with these sleazoid films, that his imagination was fully engaged, and that is that underneath the placid surface of family man and father of many and exemplary suburban American, there lurked a real sort of distrust of all those values and a sort of desire to see them all brought crashing down by monolith monsters. There's a relish for the destruction of all the tawdry stuff of American culture. There's a relish for sort of bosom-ripping sexuality. This guy didn't have 8 children by accident.
What's important about Reynold is he set himself very, very high standards. And even though he's sometimes given jobs to do over a weekend, he really didn't skimp. If he was going to show a cast of thousands running in terror, he would pretty damn well make sure that every one of those faces had an expression, and an expression that's different from all of those around him. He didn't skimp on those details. The downside came when the movie studios printed the posters very cheaply, very inexpensively, and all of those great faces and details became a blur.
Nowheres in the painting will you find that he's faking it or not quite finishing something, leaving an important aspect of the figure or the action out. Not Reynold. He put it in, even in a simplified way. It was there. And that's what grabbed you when you saw his things and why you knew it was Reynold.
In stylistic terms, what I find tremendously appealing about them is the forward-directed energy. This is the case of a lot of Brown's work. This is the case of some of his magazine covers, too, where you have a submarine or an airplane zooming right out of the picture at you. Similarly, when you're walking past the motion picture theater, it's either an aggressive bosom is popping out of the picture plane at you, or it's a spaceship, or it's a gigantic monster is actually reaching out into space, rupturing those polite boundaries between the place art stops and the place life starts. That boundary that was something that fascinated the pop art generation of the 1960s. They were always trying to figure out where that boundary went. Well, the previous generation of illustrators had already figured that out.
The man could depict anything. He could draw anything. He seemed to be able to draw anything from any angle, any kind of scene, any kind of perspective.
Well, Reynold always has had the ability of seeing something once and then being able to draw it. Weeks later, sometimes months later, it didn't matter. He would remember it. So a lot of scenes that required different positions or different costumes, if he had seen the costume once, he knew how to put that costume on the person so it would look authentic. I'm standing there with this boot and the sword and my arm up and very dramatic. And then he puts Maureen O'Hara on me.
In the case of Brown's work, the artist's ego is so submerged in the object being depicted that the feeling of the palpable conviction with which the object lives is multiplied exponentially. That's part of what creates the energy in Brown's work. In a fine artist, that same amount of energy might go into ego enhancement and calling attention to the fact that this is the work of X. In Brown's work, in the work of any really good illustrator, it seems to me, all of that energy is taken and channeled into the objects being shown to you so that they take on a kind of ferocity. And that's what's so wonderful about the 50s movie posters, that every object in them is ferociously, gigantically, humongously present and real.
Unencumbered with taste or historical accuracy, Hollywood gushed dozens of overblown sword and sandal epics, chock-a-block with hot-blooded stars and skimpy costumes. The distant past came to the screen in epics like Spartacus, Ben-Hur, and How the West Was Won.
The epics were a real translation of American love of material objects, a translation of prom dresses and automobiles as chariots into remote times and places to give us a sense, I think, of our sort of historical rightness. They also gave us a wonderful opportunity to see history Americanized. I think particularly of the scene in Spartacus where Tony Curtis rushes in to see Kirk Douglas and is about to pledge his honor and his fortune forever, and he rushes into the room, falls to one knee and says, "Spartacus, Spartacus, I will follow you to the ends of the earth." Now, if that isn't Americanized history, I don't know what is. One of the great lines in motion picture history.
Well, in the 30s and 40s, there were great stars, great romantic stars, the Clark Gables of the world, the Claudette Colberts, the Hedy Lamars, and the Greta Garbos. And the heads of the studios wanted those people depicted in really romantic, dreamy, sexy ways that suggested sex, but also left something to the imagination. Well, when you flash forward to the 50s, the times were different. The women were made to look more buxom, the men made to look more beefy, and the sexual currency between them had to be much more electric and far more direct. So you get more than passionate gazes. You get clinches, you get kisses, and you get people looking very much like they're ready to hit the sack.
The 50s movie audience, at least for love slaves of the Amazon and monsters on campus and such films, was not, in general, mom and dad. These were Saturday afternoon movies. The fact that they appealed so mightily is sort of fascinating and creepy all at the same time.
We were trying to make films that were true to the youthful experience. The youthful audience was taking part of their cues as to what their experience should be from us. And we were partially leading them, but we were heavily led by them as well.
A whole generation was modeling their behavior on things like how the boy and the girl interacted in such films. And that's something that the posters always bring home to you. It's the girl who needs protection. It's the girl whose clothes are falling off. It's the girl who's the sex object, and it's the square-shouldered young man who is somehow standing between her and destruction. I think in terms of sexual roles, when you think of Betty Friedan standing in her kitchen and despairing in the 1950s, you can understand in a way why she might.
The women always had to have at least one shoulder strap hanging down, a décolleté that would not show too much, but would show just enough to titillate the audience.
Bug-eyed monsters, again, menacing a lady wearing pants. And the moral of that story is, of course, pay attention to what your mother says.
Run, Ruth, run!
And your parish priest and everybody else. And good girls do not wear slacks.
They're usually the beautiful, frightened, screaming, voluptuous creature in the tattered red dress. That's pretty much how women were circumscribed in those movies and in those posters.
Large lips, thin neck, high cheekbones, and Maybelline, beautifully made up Maybelline eyes. She could never have kinky hair. She could never be anything other than a white, presumably Anglo-Saxon Protestant of an upper middle class persuasion.
Women were constantly engaging in extremely hazardous behavior while wearing 4-inch tall heels. Even scientists, female scientists, and there are a couple that turn up in 1950s horror movies, are always shown primarily as sex objects and secondarily as brains. And of course, they always have to be killed because they have too many of them. So the lesson you learn is stay with the high-heeled baby.
The lurid, gusto-filled horror and action romance epics being churned out to entertain the movie-obsessed masses went on virtually uninterrupted throughout the decade. For every Seventh Seal and La Strada, there were 100 monolith monsters. Lacking the selling power of a bona fide star, producers relied on the poster to tease potential ticket buyers with the promise of a tantalizing story.
Monolith Monsters is really an early ecological horror movie. It's the earth rebels. It's rocks that are terrorizing these people, and that's an absurd notion, but kind of a subversive notion for the 50s. And audiences rebelled. They wanted to see a dinosaur. They wanted to see a Mothra. They wanted to see a giant creature from the unknown, not rocks. So they didn't go for it. But the poster is charming, and the movie is even more charming.
It's the very fiber of one's world that's being destroyed here, the great institutions of American society. You can even see your grandpa's Ford truck being destroyed. The automobile industry goes down for the count. Telephone poles falling over. This is enough to strike terror into the heart of any child. You can identify all the types and sorts of American mankind and womankind in the foreground of the work about to be blown to bits. Your neighbors, your friends, your teachers, the local minister, even the dog. Meanwhile, out of this terrible world flee the primal couple coming right at you. Maybe it's Ozzie and Harriet, except, of course, Harriet's dress has to be ripped right down to the navel to convey this suitable sense of sexual bonding that will no doubt go on immediately after the curtain has fallen. Brown's illustrations that deal with these same filmic topics positively delight in chaos. There is never one suggestion or one iota of a suggestion that order will be restored. What he likes is the sense of disorder. Houses being smashed, individuals being propelled out of the picture into, thrown out of Eden into America, bug-eyed monsters running amok, that kind of thing. Never do you get a sense that the army will finally arrive and order will be restored and we'll all live happily ever after. The outcome is always up in the air and open.
In 1965, Brown undertook an ad campaign for The Night Walker, directed by William Castle and starring Barbara Stanwyck. He based his composition on a late 18th century painting by Swiss artist Henri Fuseli. It was to be the most controversial picture of his career.
Incubus was a demon, a demonic force that came and raped women in the middle of the night while they were dreaming. So Brown was clearly aware of this composition and incorporated this into his work.
Brown, being a great filmic artist, gives us a toots, a genuine babe in a white dress, strategically arranged so that just by the merest accident it happens to be pulled up right to her hips, revealing lots of creamy thigh.
Now, in The Night Walker, I think Reynold Brown perhaps got some directive from Misha Kalis as to how they wanted to sell this movie, but I think he went in a very interesting and dangerous and perhaps self-revelatory direction. What you see is clearly a creature from someone's id, a primal creature, a satyr, almost straddling a woman in a nightgown who is asleep, but asleep very voluptuously. And I suspect that Reynold was probably tapping something that was very interesting and primal and sexual to himself, very peculiar to himself, since there's nothing of that in the movie.
The other interesting thing is the way in which the work does illustrate the very common tension that existed between the illustrator and the art director. So what Brown did in this poster was to use the faces of some of the better-known art directors that he had worked with as the monsters, these lewd, cackling faces overlooking the scene. And so thereby transforming his nemesis into part of his, in effect taking control of the picture by putting the art directors in it and doing with them what he will.
He did more than just give an example of a horror film with some sex in it. He gave them a glimpse into a nightmare, a glimpse into their own psyches, into their own unconscious.
I think what's interesting is that the art directors of Universal, when they saw the images that Reynold had come up with for this movie, decided that they would use them, but they would expunge all of that gallery of leering faces, and they would put some kind of loincloth or BVDs on the satyr. So it's sort of a lesson for the poster artist that you can perhaps break the boundaries and perhaps you can tap into something that's a little more primal, but you will be stomped for that. There was a tremendous antagonism and animosity between the art directors and the illustrators. The poster artists were paid very little. Their work was often derided or mocked or ridiculed by the art directors. And I think most potently, their names were always taken off the artwork because the art directors wanted to keep them in check. He was a very elegant, soft-spoken, quiet man. And I think the art directors recognized in him perhaps something they could manipulate.
Whatever they wanted, he'd let his imagination go and he could come up with a drawing. He was very proud of what he had done. And he felt he had done the best he could for the time allotted to him. And when he would take it in, he was hoping he'd get some word of encouragement, praise, whatever. And generally, they would say, "Thank you, Reynold," give a grunt or two, and that was the end of it.
Well, more than likely, an illustrator on presenting a finished piece of artwork or even a sketch would be lucky if he got more than a grunt. I mean, and for an artist as sensitive and as dedicated as Reynold, this was pretty devastating. But this was a control mechanism. This was a way of saying, well, you're good, but you're not that good, and you can be replaced.
He was not a salesman. You see, if he'd had some of the chutzpah and the selling ability, he would be far better known than he is and far wealthier than he was.
I think Reynold too often did what he was told. I think he was perhaps a little too concerned about making sure that he would get the next job and not challenging the perceptions of the art director or the conventions of his time.
Maybe he made a better fit with the world of the 1950s. Maybe that's the world that released his anger, and I see a lot of anger in the movie work. And as for the role of the art director, I sort of think of the role of the art director as sort of like the role of the ambient culture. He just sort of set up the circumstances in which the true emotion could vest itself. That's really no different from a gallery director telling Thomas Hart Benton in 1928, "Hey, Tom, if you go out on the road and do me some drawings, I'll hang them for you." I really don't see too much difference there.
Hollywood had turned the corner in the late 50s, Added to themes of science and technology enslaving humanity were increasingly graphic depictions of sex and violence. The straight-laced artist cringed with each new assignment. Finally, his distaste for the whole studio scene bubbled over. Among his last assignments was the Dunwich Horror, starring Sandra Dee, the former star of Tammy, prostrate in a shredded dress. That did it.
It bothered him. He would do the drawing, but he didn't care for them, so he would have a tendency to cover them up or turn them up, the paper upside down, if one of the children happened to come near him, because he didn't want them to see their father doing this kind of a drawing.
I think finally what brought Brown's reign over the poster era to an end was that movies really changed. They became more about beach party and sex, and I think the kind of innocence that Brown liked about the movies that he was assigned to do really ended. And how many variations could he wring on the same sort of thing? Movies became much more explicit, and he didn't want any part of it.
Quietly, the unsigned artist of more than 300 feature film posters walked away from a 20-year career. Brown did what dozens of other disillusioned commercial illustrators did in the face of what they thought was an unsavory trend. He took up Western painting, and after a few phone calls from panicky studio executives, was entirely forgotten. He was now the artist he always wanted to be, painting landscapes, cowboys, and Indians. Now Brown would show the world his own version of how the West was won. Dozens of highly romanticized, painstakingly rendered paintings followed.
Most of the pictures that Brown painted for the movies were subjects that he had very little interest in, but he knew that he had to make them look exciting and larger than life. And it was a strain to have to continue to do this kind of picture. And eventually he became satiated with this exaggerated way of painting, and he really wanted to paint realistically and paint real people doing believable and real things.
It's interesting to me that the man should have left Hollywood in disgust and taken up other pursuits and wanted to be a fine painter, because in my estimation, where he was operating at his finest was precisely in matching this titanic energy to the energies of the 1950s.
I think the discipline refined him. I think it made him adhere to a certain line, and even though he didn't want to do those things, he was best at them. When left to his own devices, he was more routine, rather ordinary in fact. But somehow the strictures, perhaps the tension that existed between what he thought he could do and what he was assigned to do, and between him and his art directors, led him to some anger, maybe some force that was missing when he was left to his own devices.
5 years later, a stroke left his dominant left side paralyzed. The effect on his art was devastating. Always, he continued to paint. In 1981, Brown moved out of Los Angeles, set down roots in Nebraska, and found tranquility among the buttes and prairies that dominated the landscape outside his studio window. In August 1991, he died, an unfinished painting still on his easel. He was 73 years old.
He actually conveyed feeling, conveyed emotion, made you want to, made you feel something, and made you go to see the picture for that reason.
The Brown of the 1950s and the early 1960s is a person operating at the absolute top of his form, is still today engaging and interesting to look at, is creating extremely provocative images that juxtapose archetypes of American culture in an extremely tantalizing fashion.
Well, I think that art can happen in the strangest places, even when you're trying to sell tickets or to sell a star or a movie. I think that art can happen in that way, and I think it's only elitism that prevents us from looking at things as, or dividing things between art and trash. I think the demarcation lines between them are fairly artificial, particularly when you're dealing with Hollywood and the movies.
Why not look at the artist for what the artist has accomplished, for what the artist has done? Or why can't we accept the idea that the pop artist, to whom his work is sometimes compared, borrowed lots of their best ideas from a misspent youth in the motion picture theaters of America?
Now movie posters are about photographs of stars. Then they were about drama. They were about epic scale. They were larger than life, and it's too bad if we forget that there once was a time when movies were the great escape.
Brown was seen by more people than saw, I think to this day, any piece of fine art in America. He profoundly influenced the viewing habits and the lives of a whole generation of Americans. He mirrored many of their most existential and deepest fears and desires. Isn't that enough?